Welcome back. After a long and tiring day, allow yourself to slow down, loosen your shoulders, take a deep, steady breath, and sink into this quiet journey. It's just you now, your breath, and the stories waiting to unfold. Throughout the long arc of human history, few moments have been as dark as the years when the Black Death swept across Europe. An invisible plague, small as a grain of sand, yet powerful enough to erase an entire city in just a matter of weeks. Imagine this. You open your eyes one morning to a world without human voices, hearing only the creaking wheels of a cart dragging corpses across a cold, stone-paved street. No one knows what is killing them. No one knows how to survive. It was a time when fear seeped into every breath, when people tried to fall asleep to the sound of the sick groaning and death bells tolling in the distance. And amid that chaos, a chilling question echoed endlessly in the mind. If it were you, how would you live? In this video, we will step into the very heart of this terrifying pandemic, confronting the darkness that smothered an entire continent, so we can understand how humanity clung to its fragile thread of life. Take a deep breath and prepare to enter the longest night in history. As the night of the plague began to fall, the people in the port cities still could not grasp the nature of the darkness creeping toward them. All they knew was that, on a day without warning, death had stepped ashore, silent, soundless, without introduction. And to trace the path of this disaster, we must turn back to its origin. The abandoned ships drifting into the harbor, quiet as giant coffins washing up on the shores of fate. At first, no one paid attention. A ship arriving late was nothing unusual in bustling trading cities. But that morning, the harbor was engulfed in an uncanny stillness. The sailors who should have been on deck, tying ropes, shouting to one another, were nowhere to be seen. The oars hung loosely. The cabin doors were half open, letting the sea breeze slip through with a sound like the dying sigh of someone drawing their last breath. No one knew that, at that very moment, death was already there, not in the form of a monstrous beast, but in the tiny wings of the fleas clinging to the backs of rats. When the first group approached the ship to investigate, they discovered a scene that made the blood in their veins freeze. Every sailor was dead. Some had collapsed at the dining table, others lay in their sleeping quarters, their eyes wide open as if witnessing something utterly terrifying. No wounds, no final words, only the cold stiffness of bodies silently claimed by death. And from those corpses, the rats began to crawl out, nonchalant, natural, as if the voyage had always belonged to them. As the anchor wheel dropped and the ropes touched the ground, the invisible killer officially stepped into the city. The rats ran between people's feet, slipped into warehouses, and climbed onto crates of food. No one noticed. For centuries, rats in the harbor were nothing unusual, but no one knew that on their backs, the fleas, swollen with blood, were carrying a disease that would make an entire continent tremble. The moment the fleas left the bodies of dead rats to leap onto humans, the life of the city began its countdown. The cruelty of the Black Death lay in this. No one knew its origin, so every attempt to fight it was like trying to push back the darkness with a candle on the verge of extinction. The first people infected had no idea what they had done wrong. Some merely walked past the docks, some had lifted a bag of flour from a warehouse, some had absent-mindedly stroked a cat that had once played near the ropes of a merchant ship. 3 days later, they developed fevers, swollen buboes, coughed blood, and died. Rumors spread like wind slipping through cracks in the walls. People began to understand, or at least believed they understood, that everything began with that ship. Fear traveled faster than the plague itself. Families burned incense at their doors, poured vinegar along their pathways, scattered herbs at the foot of their walls to ward off the sickening air. But how could they have known that the plague was not an evil spirit drifting in the sky, but existed in creatures so small the human eye could not see them? In the minds of those trembling from sleeplessness, the image of that dead ship grew into a haunting specter. At night, when the sea wind whistled through the shutters, people imagined the groan of anchor ropes, the gentle slap of waves against the hull, like ghostly knocks on the door between the living and the dead. as if that ship, with its silent corpses, was still calling for help, even though it was far too late. One of the most chilling images from this era was that of another ship found offshore, empty, unmanned, drifting like a phantom. When people boarded it, they found only the corpse of the captain slumped against the helm, his lifeless eyes gazing toward the sky. In the cargo hold, dozens of crates were overturned, with hundreds of rats scurrying in panic. A priest who witnessed the sight once wrote, "I felt as though I was watching death itself preparing to make landfall." From harbors like these, waves of plague rolled into cities like tides of poison. No one could see the enemy. No one understood it. And no one was fast enough to outrun it. But in a deeper layer, the source of the catastrophe did not lie solely in the rats or the fleas, but in humanity itself. Our expanding trade routes across Europe, the endless arrival of merchant ships, the flourishing cities packed tightly with life. In that growth, the disease needed only the tiniest crack to seep in, like water slipping into stone, eventually splitting the whole mountain apart. So, when we ask, how could one survive in such a time? The first answer is to understand that every catastrophe has an origin, no matter how small or invisible it may be. Rats, fleas, the empty merchant ships, they were merely links in a chain of lethal reactions. But once they entered the city, people were forced to change how they lived, how they breathed, how they slept. Because a single careless moment, a single touch, a single breath of tainted air could become the end of a life. In that darkness, the story of the plague's origins is not merely a lesson in history, but a chilling reminder. What terrifies humans most is not death itself, but the invisible death, faceless, silent, creeping through every crack of ordinary life. And that is why the era of the Black Death became one of the longest, deepest, and most unforgettable nightmares in the memory of humankind. At first, the plague spread slowly, silently, like darkness crawling across rooftops at midnight. One sick person collapsed with a fever, then another. Then a few more in a distant neighborhood, a faraway village, a tax outpost outside the city walls. No one connected these deaths. No one realized quickly enough that something invisible was wrapping itself around them. But it was that invisibility that made it all the more terrifying because it robbed people of their ability to fight back. If you were facing a monster, you could at least charge at it, run from it, or see its jaws before being swallowed. But when facing a plague, you could not see anything at all. You didn't know where it came from. You didn't know when it touched you. You didn't know the exact moment your life had already ended. All they knew was that when dead rats began appearing everywhere, the fleas had already abandoned their bodies to search for new hosts, humans. Cities at the time were crowded and cramped. The narrow, dark alleys were like clogged arteries where air could not circulate, where every cough echoed sharply like the flap of a raven's wings. House pressed against house, rooftops nearly touching, large families living together in spaces no bigger than a modern room. All of it formed the perfect paradise for a plague. The fleas jumped from rats to clothing, from clothing to human skin. Just a single leap, a movement as small as a blink, and a person's life was placed on the scales of fate. Some people merely touched a door handle and woke up feverish the next morning. Some only slept in a bed where someone ill had lain the day before. Some simply breathed in a room whose windows hadn't been opened for 2 days. One breath. Sometimes that was all it took. Fear began spreading faster than the disease itself. People no longer dared hold hands. They didn't dare embrace their children. They refused to touch anything brought into the house from outside. Some walking through the market would turn away immediately at the sound of a stranger's cough, pull a cloth over their nose, and run home as if chased by ghosts. But fear could not protect them from what they could not see. Because the enemy was not a curse, not sorcery, not the wrath of a god, but a creature smaller than a speck of dust drifting in sunlight, yet powerful enough to drown an entire civilization. And then, when the death toll rose so high that corpse carts rolled day and night, people finally began to ask, who is the real killer? But the question had no answer, no evidence, nothing to point to. In the few surviving journals, someone wrote that fear back then felt like fearing a cold draft in a castle. You could not see it, could not touch it, yet each night it slid into your bed, slipped through layers of blankets, and slowly gnawed away your strength. People of that time knew nothing of bacteria, no parasites, nothing about the mechanisms of infection. All they knew was that death could appear from nothing, like a colorless, scentless, poisonous wind that could steal the breath from a healthy person. One of the most horrifying moments ever recorded was when a young boy recounted that, one afternoon, he saw a rat staggering across his yard. It moved slowly, unnaturally, then collapsed and lay still. And just hours later, his mother began coughing violently, her skin burning like coal. Then his father. Then the boy himself. No one believed that a creature as small as a rat, something that merely scurried around kitchens nibbling at grain, could drag an entire family into the mouth of a mass grave. But that was the brutal truth of that era. What made that time more chilling than anything else was the silence of death. It didn't strike like a storm, didn't scream, didn't announce itself with thunder. It simply spread. Like the shadow of a hanged man falling across a wall, like ink bleeding across paper, like night swallowing the sky after sunset, unstoppable by any human effort. When people finally realized the enemy was too small to see, they understood a heartbreaking truth. No matter where they hid, death could follow. It hid in the cracks of the walls, it hid in sacks of grain, it hid in the layers of fabric on their clothes, it hid on the bodies of animals they had lived with all their lives. And from that moment on, the city sank into an unprecedented panic, where every breath became suspicious, every touch a threat. But from here, another question slowly emerged, a question the people of that time could never answer, but one we will continue to explore in the next parts. How could humans live, sleep, or stay calm when death as small as a grain of dust might be crawling right across their skin? And to understand that, we must continue walking deeper into the eye of the pandemic, where people struggled not only to survive, but to keep their minds from being swallowed whole by fear. When people began to understand, however faintly, that the enemy was hiding within creatures as small as dust motes, fear was no longer a vague feeling lingering inside them. It became something real, something with shape, with shadow, with heavy footsteps creeping through every street. And at that very moment, the city began to release a sound no one ever wanted to hear: the sound of crying. At first, it came sparsely, weakly, but only a few weeks later, crying spilled across every road. It was not the ordinary weeping that came with losing a loved one, but a strangled, ruptured cry erupting from a despair so deep it scraped the bottom of the soul. If in the previous part, death was silent, like darkness crawling across the walls, then in this part, it screamed, echoing through every house, every alley, every window. The air in the city grew thick, not only with the stench of death, but with grief. Imagine waking up on a morning in that time. You open your eyes, if it could even be called waking up, since most people hadn't slept properly for days. A cough from the house next door rasps through the walls, coarse, broken. From afar, you hear wooden wheels rolling across the street, creaking slow, dragging the darkness behind them. The corpse cart. A sound so familiar that people no longer flinched. Children cried from hunger. Mothers cried because they didn't know when their turn would come. The cries of those who lost their children blended with the cries of those who lost their wives. Doors remained shut tight, but the despair inside still seeped out, like the cracking sound of pottery shattering against a wall. Even the strongest souls, even those who believed in the Almighty with unwavering devotion, could not hold back their tears. Because they knew they weren't crying for just one person. They were crying for themselves, for their helplessness, for the feeling of being trapped in a dead-end alley where even breathing felt like a blade pressed to the throat. Earlier, the enemy still hid underground, in the fur of rats, in the shadows of crevices. But here, the enemy exposed its aftermath, no longer bothering to hide, and the city, once resilient, now seemed strangled under the weight of sorrow. Every home had someone sick, There was no time to cry for each person, no strength left to mourn them properly. Crying came in bursts, then broke off, then came again, like a violin string pulled to the edge of snapping. In many homes, a child lost their mother in the morning, and by nightfall, their father collapsed too. There was no one to comfort them, no one to hold them. They simply stood beside the bodies of their parents, tears rolling down their faces, calling out hopelessly. There is nothing in this world more brutal than a child calling mother in a room where only the dead remain. Priests went from house to house, trying to perform rites as quickly as possible, but their lungs could not withstand the heavy, tainted air. Some coughed up blood mid-prayer. Some collapsed at the doorstep of a house where someone lay dying. In those days, merely stepping inside a sick person's home was already a gamble with fate. Prayers, meant to bring peace, now sounded like the final breaths of hope. And as the chants blended with the cries, the city seemed to echo with a fractured, agonizing symphony, each note splintering under its own weight. Healers, once seen as the final lifeline, began to flee. Many disappeared into the night, carrying their medical texts with them. Others died on the streets, exhausted after moving from house to house. No healers remained. No one understood the blackened bruises on the skin, the egg-sized swelling of lymph nodes, the fevers that drove people into delirium, screaming in the night. The cries of those who lost family mingled with the cries of the sick themselves, as they felt death crawling up their throats like a serpent coiling tightly around their windpipe. Evening was when the city sank into its deepest despair. When the sun vanished, the darkness grew so dense that even candlelight could not pierce the corners of a room. Cries rose along the alleys, sometimes only a faint sob, sometimes a scream that tore the throat raw. And amidst that chaos there were moments of sudden, terrifying silence, the moment a family lost their last remaining member. No more crying, only silence. A silence heavier than grief itself, like a black cloth draped over the house, smothering the entire street. It was these silences that made the pain 100 times sharper. When the cries exceeded what a human heart could endure, another feeling began to take root: numbness. People heard the corpse carts without turning their heads, heard their neighbors screaming yet continued sitting motionless. When too much suffering floods the heart, it hardens, not out of strength, but because there is no space left for more pain. There were families whose doors were knocked on 3 days in a row. The father died today, the mother tomorrow, and the child the day after. Those who survived stared at each other with hollow eyes, no tears left, no reactions. Crying had taken everything, but what was more terrifying than crying was when the crying stopped. For when a city no longer echoed with tears, it meant the dead far outnumbered the living, so much so that the survivors no longer had the strength to weep. When grief surpassed the threshold of endurance, people slipped into paralysis. Everything became a nightmare where time stopped and hope withered. That was the moment the city truly froze in death. And in that suffocating air, one question lingered in every mind. Will I hear my own crying tomorrow? That question slid across the mind like a thin blade, leaving a cold incision. For in those days, no one knew whether they would live until sunset or become a nameless corpse dragged away at dawn. Crying was not merely the sound of sorrow, it was the ticking of an hourglass, a reminder that everyone stood at the edge of the cliff. Yet within those cries, another truth began to surface, that humans, no matter how terrified, exhausted, or broken, always tried to survive. Because after the crying, people still had to go on, still had to find food, still had to care for the ones they loved, still had to plan for tomorrow, if tomorrow would even come. And from here, we move into the next part, when living conditions themselves became weapons of death, and why the familiar environment turned into an accomplice of the plague. When cries echoed across the city, when every house shut tight like a coffin still breathing, people began to recognize a truth colder than death itself. They were not only being killed by the plague, but by their own homes, their own streets, their own everyday lives, the very things they once believed were safe. If in the earlier parts, death lurked in the shadows on the backs of rats and broken breaths, then now it appeared openly, more clearly than ever. inside the very environment humans lived in. No one knew the exact moment when living conditions turned into killing machines, but everyone felt it. Through the stench rising from sewage canals, through the layers of rotting trash compacted by time and neglect, through the sounds of rats scrambling frantically beneath wooden floorboards. The narrow, dark alleys of the old city, once merely uncomfortable because of their dampness and crowding, now became perfect highways for the plague, like decaying veins pumping poison into the city's heart. The air grew dense, not only with the smoke of burning herbs, but with the smell of dead animals, sewage, and the bodies of people too exhausted to bathe for days. All of it fused into a heavy mixture that made every breath feel like pulling toxins straight into the lungs. Homes then were built tightly packed, wall against wall, roof touching roof. In some places, simply stretching out a hand from your window meant touching the wall of your neighbor's house. People once thought such closeness brought warmth, familiarity. But when the plague arrived, that closeness became a curse. One sick person could infect an entire street. One infected home could become a chamber of death. One rat scurrying across the rooftops could sow death in 10 households. Inside those darkened houses, human breath, sickness, and the damp air trapped within stone walls merged into a swamp of death. The living lay beside the dying. The dying lay beside the dead. No one dared open their windows. No one dared step outside. In the suffocating darkness, so thick it felt like fog, even opening one's eyes made the world spin from lack of air. Outside, the situation was worse. Wastewater overflowed into the gutters, carrying trash, animal droppings, and sometimes even decaying body parts from the slaughterhouses. The city had no sanitation system. People simply threw their garbage out the window. In peaceful times, it caused foul smells. In plague times, it created the perfect ecosystem for disease to flourish. Rats grew fat from leftover food. Fleas multiplied like fire, racing through dry straw. The stench of dead. Animals blended with the scent of the living and the dead alike. No one realized they were living inside a giant machine where everything contributed to killing them. There was no safe place. Not the bedroom, not the kitchen, not the pantry, not even the local chapels meant for prayer. In the eyes of death, the city was nothing more than a rotting wooden chessboard with every crack wide enough for him to slip through and spread terror. Rainy nights were particularly terrifying. The rains, once symbols of cleansing, now spread corruption even further. Rainwater mixed with filth, carrying waste and disease from higher to lower streets. Flooded alleyways became murky rivers, and just one small wound on the foot, a scrape from a rusty nail, could drag a person swiftly toward death. Shabby houses, low-built, were flooded by rainwater, turning them into damp nests of infection. Families huddled on makeshift straw beds, listening to rats screech, to drops of water falling from rotting wooden roofs. Every sound reminding them they were living inside the cradle of the plague. And in that suffocation, the human mind was worn down day by day. Families did not dare breathe deeply, afraid their own breath carried the disease, did not dare touch one another, fearing their hands were bridges for death, did not dare open their doors, fearing the wind would bring sickness in, did not dare wash their faces with well water, frightened by rumors of poisoned wells. The more they closed themselves in, the more they suffocated. Living conditions, once the simple backdrop of life, had become a massive trap with no escape. People longed to simply step outside and inhale fresh air, but even that air now felt like an invisible blade. And filth was not the only killer. Even clean places were no safer. Wealthy homes with polished stone floors, spacious rooms, warm fireplaces, were not spared. The herbs they burned, juniper, rosemary, sage, masked the odor of death, but not the disease. Thick stone walls kept warmth in, but also sealed the plague inside like a mausoleum. In that luxury, many died more quietly than the poor, because they believed wealth protected them, and that belief delayed their realization. But the cruelest part was how living conditions forced the living and the dead to share the same space. In a small house with no separate rooms, no coffins, and no quick removal of bodies, Someone who died at night might lie there until morning, or sometimes the next day. Their loved ones, themselves feverish or trembling with fear, still had to breathe the same air, sleep in the same room, exist beside the corpse. The odor of death, the terror, the coldness, all hung like a toxic cloud that would not disperse. It was then that people began to understand a brutal truth. They were not only killed by the plague, they were being killed by the environment they had built with their own hands, and like every cruelty of that era, devastating living. Conditions were not merely the result of poverty or ignorance. They were the product of a society unprepared for catastrophe. A society that built cities like labyrinths, damp, cramped, lightless, airless. In that labyrinth, death simply walked in and kept walking until no one was left standing. Yet within this despair, a question began to crack through dry, trembling lips. How do you survive when your own home can kill you? That question opens the next chapter. How people turned their homes into fortresses, resisting death with every weapon they could imagine. Herbs, vinegar, waxed cloth, and the fragile belief that survival was still possible. When living conditions turned into weapons of death, when every corner of a wall, every crack in a door, every stone underfoot could be a place where death seeped through, people were left with only one choice: to turn their homes into fortresses. Not mighty fortresses of stone walls and moats, but desperate strongholds built with everything they had: cloth, wood, herbs, vinegar, fire, and trembling hands filled with fear. No one had time to think. Every action was frantic. Every decision bore the urgency of someone standing on the edge of a cliff, half a heartbeat too slow, and they would fall straight into death. On the morning after the city became drenched in crying, people began slamming their doors shut. Not one home at a time, but entire streets at once. Bang! Like thunder, like warning bells, like a declaration that they would fight until their last breath. Thick planks were nailed over doorways. Cracks were stuffed with cloth straw. Anything that might block the sick air they believed drifted through the atmosphere. Every hammer strike was a rasp across raw nerves, the pounding echo of terrified hearts. Hurry! Seal it tighter. Don't let the wind get in. This urgency spilled from one home to the next like dominoes toppling. No shouting, no commander, only primal instinct. Flee, barricade, block everything. In many families, people turned to herbs, not because they truly worked, but because they had no other option. Juniper, rosemary, sage, bundles of them burned constantly, their pale smoke curling up like frozen mist, clinging to moldy walls. Mothers waved smoke around windows, around corners, around beds. The smoke stung their eyes, scratched their throats, made them cough, but they didn't stop. They believed the smoke was the last shield between their family and the invisible death. The scent of herbs mixed with the sharp sting of vinegar. People poured vinegar into bowls at the doorway, poured it on the floor, scrubbed their steps with it. Some even soaked their sleeves, scarves, and bed sheets in vinegar. An absurd act in our eyes, but for them, it was a flicker of light in a suffocating pit of darkness. Inside those dimly lit homes, candles flickered, casting warped shadows on the walls, like twisted silhouettes from a nightmare. Children wrapped in blankets sat close to their mothers, wide-eyed, watching the frantic movements of the adults. One child asked, "Mother, why are we closing everything?" The mother could not answer, not because she didn't know, but because no words could describe the horror descending upon them. The pressure was not only physical, it strangled the mind. Outside, the corpse carts still rolled, their creaking wheels slicing into people's sanity. Some families, just as they finished sealing their doors, suddenly heard knocking. Knock, 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 the knock of quarantine officials, the knock of death, the knock everyone feared. People froze. The knock came again, then again. Some held their breath, praying the sound would move to the next house. In that moment, fear was a cold blade pressed against the back of the neck. Were they knocking to warn, to collect bodies, to order the family into isolation? Every knock was a suspended death sentence. In poorer districts, the desperation was worse. Small houses, low roofs, not enough wood to seal every gap. People stuffed old cloth, torn blankets, even jackets into the cracks. With no vinegar, they used salt water. With no herbs, they burned straw, letting thick, acrid smoke fill the home. The choking smoke made children cough violently. Mothers had to wave the smoke away while clinging to their children, pressing their ears to the door, listening for footsteps outside. Every sense was strained like a taut violin string. Just one strange sound, a rat's squeal, a neighbor's door slamming, something dropping from a roof, was enough to make them flinch. The city had become a dying creature, and every noise was its ragged, stumbling heartbeat. Yet in the panic, people still had to live, still had to eat, still had to tend to the sick, still had to hope, though that hope was as thin as paper torn by wind. Some families built quarantine rooms by hanging waxed cloth as makeshift walls. Some dug small pits inside their homes to keep herbs burning through the night. Some stuffed every ventilation hole, suffocating themselves rather than letting sick air seep in. Every action, reckless, desperate, frantic. It was simply the only way they knew to fight. In sleepless nights, the crackle of candle flames sounded like the footsteps of time. People sat close together, listening to the wind slipping through the roof beams, to the distant screams, to the furious pounding of their own hearts. They whispered to themselves, "Just get through tonight. One more night. Just one more." But every night was like that. Every night heavy as stone. Every night a battle between life and fear. And in their darkest moments, a realization began to take shape. The home was no longer a shelter. It had become a bunker, a trench, a fragile fortress built with trembling hope. They didn't know how long it would protect them. Didn't know if death waited just outside the door. Didn't know if the breath of the person beside them carried the plague. But they still sealed it shut. Still stuffed every crack, still burned herbs, still lived. Because when death stood on the doorstep, no one had the right to give up. And in the darkness of those sealed homes, amidst herb smoke and gasping breaths, something unexpected emerged: religion, faith, prayer, not as ceremony, but as the last desperate lifeline for the human spirit. When each family turned their home into a fragile fortress, when the slamming of doors echoed like the final drum beats announcing survival or death, people began to realize something else. No matter how many locks they fastened, how many cracks they sealed, how shallowly they breathed, whittling their breaths down to the sound of wind whistling, they could not lock fear out of their minds. And at that moment, another form of support emerged. Not herbs, not vinegar, not waxed cloth, but faith. In the thick darkness of sealed houses, where candlelight wavered as if ready to die, religion became the only light that did not flicker out. People prayed not because they were certain they would be saved, but because they needed a reason to live one more night. When humans are pushed to the edge of despair, they always reach for something greater than themselves, something invisible to fight the invisible terror suffocating them. Small wooden statues were placed on tables beside trembling candles, trembling in the drafts that slipped through cracks not yet sealed. Small crosses were hung hurriedly on walls. Some families placed sacred relics near the sickbed, as if holiness itself could shield them from the death creeping ever closer. Mothers held their children tight, trembling as they whispered prayers learned in childhood. Fathers clasped their hands and looked up at the ceiling as though someone stood there, listening to their faint cry for help. Through the long nights, the sound of prayer drifted across the city. Some homes prayed in low voices, others in trembling whispers, others through choking sobs. Together, they formed a thick layer of sound, like fog, spreading down every alleyway. These prayers were not meant to drown out the crying, but to keep the living from falling into the abyss of despair. Because sometimes, a single whispered prayer was enough to make a heart beat one more time. Outside, as corpse carts rolled by, even the workers murmured prayers. They knew they stood closer to death than anyone else. They knew they could fall at any moment. Yet they continued their work, because the only thing stronger than fear was the feeling that something was watching over them, marking each of their steps. And though they never said it aloud, they knew that something was the only thing keeping their knees from buckling. In many homes, prayers merged with the groans of the sick. The dying, their voices barely breaths, tried to repeat a few words as if offering their final hope back to themselves. Clouded eyes still searched for the candle flame as though it held a guiding light. No one knew whether the prayers worked. No one witnessed any clear miracles. But they believed, and that belief was what kept them from collapsing entirely. Some prayed in silence. They didn't speak a word, only sat motionless before the altar, staring at the tiny flame. Sometimes they doubted, sometimes they felt lost, sometimes they were angry. But at the end of every emotional storm, they returned to prayer, hands clasped, like a survival instinct. Because when facing an invisible death, humans could not rely on strength or knowledge. All they had left was hope, and hope often took the shape of a prayer. Some priests still risked their lives, moving from house to house, carrying holy water, carrying blessings, sometimes carrying the sorrow of knowing that the person they blessed today might not see the sun tomorrow. They no longer had time for long rites, no longer had the voice for complete liturgies. They simply placed a hand on a fevered forehead, whispered a blessing, and moved on. Every time they stepped out of a house, they inhaled deeply, as if preparing to walk from the room of the dead to the room of the soon-to-die. Among countless surviving records, one passage is repeated again and again. When everything collapses, when death stands right behind the door, people cling to God the way a drowning man clings to a broken plank. It may not save him, but without it, he will surely sink. The longest nights were when faith was tested the hardest, when the death bell tolled at midnight, long, hollow, echoing through every home like a cold proclamation that yet another soul had left the world. People could only grip each other's hands and pray harder. Those bells struck the heart like a hammer striking an anvil, each toll driving despair deeper. And yet, at that very moment, something miraculous happened. Faith did not die. Instead, it flared up like a small flame in a raging storm, flickering, fragile, but alive. Human frailty created a strange kind of strength, the strength to keep breathing through the night, to step into the next day even when the air reeked of death. Through these prayers, each family found a fragile calm that helped them endure. Some regained enough clarity to think, some grew less fearful while tending to trembling loved ones. Some found a few moments of sleep, lulled by the rhythm of whispered prayers. No one knew whether they would live. But they knew one thing. If they did not believe in something, their minds would die long before their bodies. And it was that fragile faith that gave people just enough strength to face the next wave of horror. The physicians, the bird-beaked masks, and the brutal methods they had to endure in order to prolong their lives. While religious faith allowed people to cling to the faintest glimmer of light in the darkness, another kind of hope quietly began to take shape as well. Hope in those they called physicians. They were not miracles. They were not saviors. But they were the only ones who dared step into the places everyone else fled from. Yet when invisible death wrapped itself around the city, those physicians, armed with limited tools, equipment, and knowledge, became symbols of despair rather than salvation. What they did was often no different from delivering a death sentence. That is why people called their treatments deadly measures. From the top of the street to the far end of the alleys, people began seeing the silhouette of a strange figure, a person cloaked in a long black robe, holding a wooden staff, their face hidden behind a mask with a long beak like a bird. Round glass lenses reflected candlelight, cold twin voids fixed on an emotionless surface. Children were so terrified that they hid under the bed. Adults pressed themselves against walls, torn between hoping that the figure had come to save their home, and fearing that their presence meant death was already sitting beneath their roof. That bird-beaked mask, now iconic, was at the time a sign of only one thing: someone was about to die. Inside the long beak, bundles of herbs, mint, camphor, rosemary, were stuffed tightly. Physicians believed the fragrance filtered the air, blocking bad vapors. But behind the scent, inside the dark hollow of the mask, there was only the hot breath of the wearer, heavy and trapped, dripping in sweat, each heartbeat reminding them that every time they stepped into a patient's home, they were stepping one foot into the reaper's scythe. They used their wooden staff to touch a patient, never their hands. They lifted clothing with the tip of the stick, pushed hair aside with it to see a face, prodded swollen buboes with it. Candlelight cast sharp shadows over each movement, making the scene look like an eerie ritual of a cult that worshipped death. And then, the real actions began. Some patients had buboes so large they bulged under the skin like black stones. Physicians believed they had to cut the buboes open, let the pus drain, if they wanted to save the patient. No anesthesia, no pain relief. Only a small knife, gloved hands in stiff leather, and the strained moans of a person trying to hold back unimaginable agony. The blade sliced, blood spilled, thick pus burst out, its rotten stench mixing with the already suffocating air. The patients screamed, writhed, their hands curling as if trying to cling to life a little longer. The physician remained cold, unflinching. They had to work quickly before the bubo burst inward and the patient died on the spot. Sometimes the patient survived for a few hours. Sometimes they died right there on the stone floor, blood soaking through the cloth, spreading into a dark stain. Other methods were more brutal still. Some believed burning the patient's body hair with fire drove away poisoned air. Others boiled vinegar and poured it directly onto you, the skin, to purify the body. Some mixed honey with charcoal and smeared it over the buboes to draw out evil. Others burned the patient's blood over glowing coals to chase the plague demon away. Doctors didn't do these things out of cruelty. They did them because they had no alternatives. They didn't understand bacteria, parasites, or infection mechanisms, but they understood one thing. If they did nothing, the patient would die. If they tried, the patient might still die. But they tried anyway, because it was the only shred of hope they could grasp. In many homes, families watched the doctor work with trembling hands. They didn't know whether to pray for their loved one's survival or pray for them to die quickly so the torment would end. When the doctor left, the screams often lingered in the wooden walls, echoes that refused to fade. Some physicians collapsed right after treating a patient. They tried to stand, but dizziness from the stench of vinegar, sweat, and death overwhelmed them. Some died on the way home, still wearing the bird-beaked mask. Children passing by froze in silence, staring wide-eyed at the figure standing stiff as a statue until adults came to carry the body away. And so, people realized a harsh truth. Even the most knowledgeable could not defeat the invisible enemy. When a physician died, hope for an entire neighborhood died with them. When they lived, hope flickered, but never steady, always trembling like a candle about to go out. Poor families who could not afford a physician had no choice but to treat themselves. They cut each other's buboes with kitchen knives, washed wounds with strong alcohol, bandaged them with torn cloth. Each cut brought screams that made every member of the household shudder. But they did it anyway, because they had seen too many die from doing nothing, like candles snuffed out by a breeze. On nights when the city sank into complete darkness, the prayers from earlier chapters blended with cries of pain and the sound of metal cutting flesh. Together, they formed an atmosphere so haunting that anyone who lived through it would carry those sounds in their nightmares for life. Yet in that chaos, some people did survive the deadly measures. Some fainted from pain, then woke days later, slowly recovering. Some lived because their buboes were cut in time. Some lived despite being burned, sliced, drained, despite enduring torture that was meant to save them. Those stories, tiny, fragile, but real, became sparks of hope, keeping hearts from collapsing entirely. But the struggle did not end there. Because to protect themselves from the invisible enemy, people still needed to build their own wall, a barrier of herbs, smoke, and vinegar that separated their home from the death-stalking just outside the door. After the physician's deadly measures, after the sound of knives slicing human skin still lingered in people's memories, they understood that if they wanted to live, they could not rely on others. They had to build a protective wall for their own families, a wall not made of stone, nor wood, but of smoke, herbs, and vinegar. This strange, fragile barrier quickly seeped into every house and every alleyway, creating an atmosphere half real, half mystical, as if the city had stepped into some ancient ritual from another world. At first, only a few families followed the doctor's advice, burning herbs to drive away sick air. But when they saw neighbors surviving, when they heard of someone recovering after a few days of fumigation, the practice spread almost as fast as the plague itself. One person lit a bundle of rosemary. 3 houses beside them lit their own. One placed a bowl of vinegar at the door. The entire street followed. The scent of herbs thickened, the sour sting of vinegar fused into the air, and soon the whole city smelled like one vast ritual, a collective attempt to push back the darkness creeping across the rooftops. Inside cramped and dim homes, herbal smoke drifted heavily. Standing in the center of a room, you could see pale wisps curling and twisting together, soft as spirits dancing in the air. Children huddled beside their mothers, watching the smoke swirl as if it were shaped by invisible hands, sketching the first circles of ancient magic. Sometimes the smoke grew so dense you could no longer tell candlelight from human faces. In those moments, the space seemed to detach itself from time, becoming a liminal place, neither fully among the living nor among the dead. People whispered that the smoke confused death, that it made the darkness hesitate before entering. No one knew whether it was true, but when death could slip through a keyhole, through the cracks in wood, through a breath, anything, no matter how fragile, could become hope. And they believed with every shred of despair left in their hearts. Alongside the smoke, vinegar became indispensable. Its sharp acidic scent filled every corridor, soaked into stone floors, into plastered walls, even into the hair of those trembling in prayer. People placed bowls of vinegar at their doors to cut the bad wind. They set vinegar on tables to filter the air. They washed their hands with vinegar after touching anything unfamiliar. Some dripped vinegar onto their clothes, scarves, bed sheets, even their pillows, turning their home into a fortress steeped in sourness, like a place preparing for some purification ritual. Some cleaned their floors with vinegar each morning. Mothers poured vinegar into basins and wiped their homes from door to hearth, each trembling stroke as firm as if they were erasing the footprints of death left behind from the night before. Many believed vinegar held spiritual energy, that it was the one thing that kept the plague from clinging to skin, from slipping into the bedroom. These rumors, despite having no proof, spread faster than the tolling of death bells. In darkness, rumor carried the weight of truth, and truth, in desperation, became the only thing people could cling to. Herbs and vinegar were not just crude medical attempts. For many, they were talismans. They hung bundles of dried herbs on windows, cupboards, and bed frames. Under candlelight, the shadows of those bundles trembled on the walls, forming strange shapes, like protective hands or the arms of spirits pushing malevolent forces out. Older folks told children that herbal smoke was the breath of their ancestors, that vinegar was the earth's tears, and together they drove evil back. Children shivered listening, but also felt a small warmth, like something invisible was still watching over them. At night, the city drowned in smoke. Seen from afar, the houses looked like dim lanterns drifting through a silver fog. The herbal scent drifted with the wind, mingling with the groans of the sick, the coughing of the dying, the prayers of those who could not sleep. The entire city seemed suspended between two worlds, not fully belonging to the living, yet not surrendered to the dead. Even the physicians in their bird-beak masks were startled. Sometimes they stepped into smoke-filled homes and felt as if they had wandered into an ancient ceremony, where death was kept at bay by swirling white spirals. They walked more slowly, spoke more softly, and were afraid to disturb the mystical veil wrapping the room. Some homes lasted through entire months of plague without a single infection. People whispered, "That house burns herbs day and night. That house washes their walls with vinegar daily. That house knows how to keep good spirits close." No one knew the truth. No one knew if it was luck or a real effect, but every survival story became proof, fueling more burning, more cleansing, more belief. Gradually, herbal smoke and vinegar became an invisible wall between the living and the dead, not strong, not perfect, but enough to make people feel that they were doing something, however small, to protect those they loved. And sometimes that feeling of control saved more lives than any plant or remedy. Smoke eased their fear, vinegar eased their panic, herbs eased their loneliness, and in a world where death waited behind every door, such small comforts carried the strength of a fortress. Yet, no matter how effective the wall of smoke and vinegar seemed, people still had to face the most primal need of all: food. And in a city suffocating under plague, finding a single meal could determine the survival of an entire family. Even though herbal smoke was burned day and night, even though vinegar was sprinkled across every doorstep, even though each family tried to build an invisible wall between themselves and death, one thing could not be postponed for long: food. Humans could skip sleep, skip joy, skip gatherings, but they could not ignore hunger forever. And during the Black Death, food was not merely a need, it defined survival. Those who had food lived longer. Those who didn't collapsed within days. In peaceful times, breakfast was a habit. During the plague, breakfast became a battle. Within the first weeks of the outbreak, the markets began to empty. Merchants refused to enter the city, farmers refused to bring vegetables into town. So many delivery workers had fallen that there was no one left to replace them. Food vanished from the stalls, bread became rare, meat became a luxury. Even flour, once present in every household, became something people spoke of only with a sigh. Families with even a little stored food began recounting every bag of grain, every piece of cheese, every hardened loaf. Mothers stared at their dwindling rice chests, feeling as though someone were squeezing their hearts. Each grain, each crumb was a heartbeat of the future. Children looked down at watery porridge, their eyes wide, sometimes glistening, sometimes simply confused. The confusion of a hungry stomach that didn't understand why. Outside, the wind swept through abandoned houses. Wooden doors banged against walls, echoing through the air, thick with the smell of herbs and vinegar. No one walked the streets, no one opened doors. Everyone knew that stepping outside to search for food could mean bringing death back home. Thus, families began eating less. Half portions of rice, a sliver of bread, porridge thin as tears. Adults fed children first, the elderly fed the adults. And the sick sometimes had to lie and watch their food given to healthier family members because everyone knew they had no chance. One evening, in the dim golden glow of candlelight, a father broke the last loaf of bread into 3. He gave a piece to his child, a piece to his wife, and kept the smallest for himself. His hands trembled, not from hunger, but from knowing that tomorrow there would be nothing. The mother looked at him, eyes brimming but refusing to cry, because even tears felt like a luxury he didn't need to see. The child ate the dry, stale bread with strange gratitude, as if it were the greatest feast of their life. They had no idea that every bite was carved out of their parents' dread. Some families had known hardship before, but never hardship like this, eating radish peels, wilted greens, things doctors once warned should never be eaten in normal times. But during the plague, nothing was normal. Everything became food. Everything could win one more day of life. People began searching in places they had always considered filthy. Abandoned storage rooms, torn bags of grain, forgotten root vegetables in dark corners. They rummaged through the dimness with shaking hands, ears alert to the scurrying of rats. Sometimes they had to compete with the very creatures that spread the plague. A rat running past made them flinch, yet hunger pulled them forward again. In these moments, survival was nothing more than instinct. Many died not from the disease, but from hunger, paired with fear. They lay in bed, stomachs hollow, throats dry, lips cracked and turning blue. When their families shook them awake, there was no response. They slipped away as gently as candles blown out by wind, even though the windows had long been sealed. But even in that bleakness, small sparks of warmth still flickered. Some families shared their last piece of bread with neighbors. Some mothers gave all their food to their children and lied, saying they had already eaten. Some elders told their families, "Eat. I've lived long enough. My life is lighter than yours." These quiet sacrifices, shining in the darkness, kept humanity from being snuffed out entirely. Sometimes, a pot of porridge cooked from the very last grains could warm an entire family. The steam drifted upward into the cold air. For a brief moment, the cries outside seemed distant and the death bells muted. That steam, fragile as life itself, became proof that there was still hope. Food grew so scarce that every meal became a ritual. Families sat together in silence, dividing portions carefully as though slicing their souls into small pieces. No one dared eat quickly. No one dared drop a single morsel. Every movement was slow, reverent, because no one knew if there would be another meal. But the harsh truth was this: even though smoke filled the homes, even though vinegar soaked every brick, even though the last crumbs were divided down to dust, something more overwhelming than hunger loomed outside. There were too many dead to bury in time. To truly understand the despair of that era, we must look upon the mass graves, the carts that never stopped rolling, and the sound of earth falling on bodies, like a funeral drum striking the darkening sky. When the last crumbs were divided down to dust, when people clung to life with a bowl of watery porridge or a piece of dry bread, the city outside had to face a truth even more brutal. The dead were so many that there was no longer enough ground to bury them. If hunger was a whip striking the living body, then corpses were a shadow crushing the mind, drowning the entire city in a rotting nightmare with no waking. Initially, people continued to observe rituals. Funerals still had attendants, priests, prayers, and a few hurried tears wiped on sleeves. But the plague had no patience for human dignity. It spread far faster than any ceremony could keep pace with. Within a short time, the number of dead far exceeded the city's ability to bury them. The corpse carts, once rare, became as familiar as morning birdsong. They rolled day and night, wooden wheels grinding against damp stone, producing a dry, heavy, rhythmic sound that haunted the air. When people heard the cart approaching from afar, they didn't need to look. They knew another soul had left the world. Those still alive lay in their beds, listening to the wheels pass by, feeling as though they were hearing a preview of their own summons. At first, each cart carried 1, 2, 3 bodies, covered with cloth. Later, there was no cloth, only bodies piled on top of one another. Some died of plague, some of hunger, some of both. Their faces were gray-blue, mouths half open as if trying to say something unfinished. Their hands stiffened in poses of reaching, grasping for something that had already slipped away. There were not enough relatives to follow and mourn, not enough tears to shed for each soul. The small graveyards around the city filled quickly. Every day, grave diggers worked until their strength gave out. Earth dug today was filled tomorrow with more bodies. Graves barely raised were pressed down by yet another corpse. Every shovelful of soil was an announcement that someone else had not survived the night. And then, a time came when there was no more space left. People no longer buried individuals. They dug massive pits, deep and wide as the gaping mouth of some giant beast waiting to devour. Bodies were brought not with ceremony, but with urgency. Time had become the enemy of the living, no longer the companion of farewell. The cart stopped at the edge of the pit. The corpse handlers, exhausted beyond emotion, no longer distinguished father from son, wife from child. They only knew to drag each heavy, nameless body and slide it into the cold, damp earth. Some fell in and struck the corpses below, turning over before landing awkwardly. Some arms caught on the pit's edge and were pushed down with a shovel, brutally but necessarily. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20 bodies stacked atop one another. No coffins, no flowers, no mourning clothes, no instruments, no hymns, no parting words. Only the labored breathing of the living doing their work as quickly as possible, hoping to return home before death, memorized their faces. Soon, the grave diggers themselves began coughing, fevering, and collapsing. The same hands that had shoveled earth over others were now taken by their colleagues, lifted onto carts, and carried to the very pits they believed they were digging for someone else. The cruel cycle had no end. The one who is buried today might lie under the soil he had turned by tomorrow. The most haunting sound of that era was not the death bell, nor the wails, but the sound of earth falling onto bodies. Each shovelful thrown down landed with a heavy, dull thud, like a buried sob. Rain-soaked soil clung to skin, to hair to the clothing of the dead. Sometimes large clumps broke apart against a motionless chest, making a hollow, chilling thunk. Those standing at the pit's edge felt their spines freeze. They knew that tomorrow, or next week, or next month, they might hear that same sound from beneath. Not everyone was buried right away. Some families kept their loved ones' bodies at home for hours, even days, because the carts never arrived, because the streets were chaotic. After all, the city's entire system had collapsed. In dark rooms, the living and the dead shared the same air. The sick lay only a few steps from the dead. At night, with darkness erasing faces, the only way to tell who was alive was by listening for breath. In the rare quiet moments between coughing, groaning, or calling out, the living sometimes thought they heard something, a faint rustle of cloth on the floor, a soft footstep on wooden boards. They did not know if the sound came from someone still alive, or not, or if it was merely the imagination of a mind shattered by grief. On nights like these, even exhausted bodies could not surrender to sleep. Gradually, people began to fear the dead. They no longer dared to embrace a loved one who had just passed, no longer dared to kiss a forehead one last time, no longer dared to keep the body long enough to say goodbye. Love, grief, honor, all had to yield to survival. Hands that once trembled from wanting to hold on now trembled because they were forced to let go. In some places, people poured quicklime into the mass graves, hoping to suppress the stench. White lime coated the bodies, creating a horrific sight. Human forms blurred beneath pale powder, as if they were being erased from the world. When rain fell, the lime dissolved into the soil, covering new graves too. No one could tell whose bones were whose limbs were whose memories belonged to which name. And in all this chaos, the most painful truth was this. There were no names. No one recorded the names of those thrown into the pits. No one remembered. No one had the strength. Anyone who managed to follow the cart and stay alive was already fortunate. Names cherished by parents, whispered in prayers, called each night before sleep, now vanished beneath layers of earth, merging into other names, until all became one silent crowd. The city slowly transformed into a colossal graveyard. No matter where you stood, beneath your feet might lie someone once buried there. The air itself smelled of endings. The living walked streets knowing that beneath the cobblestones lay people who once laughed, once loved, once dreamed. And in that suffocating atmosphere, sleep, the last refuge of the human mind, no longer offered safety. For at night, the groans, the coughs, the screams, the death bells, and other sounds with no clear source merged into one, tearing apart any attempt at rest. As the mass graves grew fuller and the soil was dug up and refilled before it even had time to cool, the city fell into a strange silence by day, then erupted into a chaos of sound by night. It was in those nights that people began to experience a unique kind of exhaustion, unable to sleep, afraid to sleep, yet unable to stay awake forever. Sleep was no longer a refuge, but a battlefield, where every sound was enough to yank them back into brutal reality. As dusk sank, darkness flooded the alleys like a rising tide. Candle flames inside the houses flickered, trembling like the breaths of the dying. Outside, the footsteps of corpse collectors faded, and then the city began to produce the sounds of its own suffering. The groans of the sick tore through the night. Some murmured weakly, like wind slipping through broken walls. Others groaned in long, ragged, broken waves, then suddenly surged again, like a string about to snap. From one house to another, from main streets to narrow alleys, the groans wove into each other, forming a symphony of dying breath. Children were jolted awake by violent coughing fits, dry coughs, wet coughs, coughing so harsh it was like needles stabbing from within. Sometimes the coughing went on all night, relentless and unbroken. Parents lay beside their children, placing a hand on their tiny chests just to feel the fragile rise and fall, to reassure themselves that in this darkness, a small life still clung on. And then, amid all the groans and coughs, the bell tolled. The church bell, its sound announcing that another life had left the city. Each peal felt like someone blowing out a candle in the night. At first, the bells rang slowly, one heavy tone at a time, like stones dropping into deep water. But as the weeks passed, the bells rang so often, no one knew who each toll was for anymore. It became a constant flow, a cold heartbeat echoing through every rooftop, every wooden wall, every blanket pulled tightly around trembling bodies. People lay there with eyes wide open, listening to the bell's long resonance, the distant call from a place no one wished to go. With every toll, they thought of those lying in the cold earth, or worse, thought of themselves in the near future. Some elderly people no longer slept at all. They sat against the wall, staring toward the covered windows as if they could see through the darkness outside. But all they saw was stillness, mixed with the labored breathing of a city on its last lungs. The truth was simple. No one slept peacefully on those nights. Every family lived inside a nightmare they could not escape. Sounds outside beat against their ears, against their hearts, startling them again and again. Some drifted off for a moment, only to wake at someone's groan. Some slept briefly, then snapped awake because a cough sounded too much like that of a loved one. In that blurred state between waking and dreaming, they could not tell if the noise came from outside or echoed from inside their own minds. The deeper the night grew, the more the city resembled a giant creature writhing in agony. Stray cats howled on rooftops, their cries echoing like human sobs. Wind pushed through cracks, hissing long, thin wails like the sighs of spirits. Ravens beat their wings across the barren fields, making dry, brittle sounds that chilled the blood. All of it blended together into a haunting nocturnal symphony no one wanted to hear. But no one could escape. Inside each house, people struggled to sleep, but the roof shook with passing winds. Candlelight stretched shadows across the walls, twisting and warping like ghosts bending over their beds. Everything around them whispered that sleep was not safe, because sometimes people slept and never woke again. The living had seen too many loved ones fade into sleep and slip away with their final breath, so they began to fear sleep itself. They feared closing their eyes, feared letting go of the last shred of vigilance, feared that if they surrendered to slumber, death would seep through the cracks and touch them with its cold hand. In the thick darkness, the sound of someone turning over was as sharp as a knock on the door. Even the slightest noise could rouse the whole household. Mothers clutched their children, listening for each breath. Fathers sat by the door, ear pressed to the wood, terrified that someone, or something, might be standing outside. Every night stretched endlessly, long and thick as a layer of black fog that refused to lift. The uninfected grew pale, eyes sunken and shadowed from sleeplessness, minds so weakened they no longer knew whether they were awake or dreaming. The infected drifted through delirium, half awake, half lost, thrashing between their own groans and the distant church bells calling them toward a place they could not resist. Many people said that during those nights they heard whispers right beside their ears, uncertain whether they belonged to another person, a hallucination, or simply the echo of their own racing heartbeat. Some claimed to feel a hand rest on their shoulder just as they began to doze, jolting them awake in terror. Others admitted hearing footsteps inside the house, despite everyone lying together in the same room. These were not ghosts. They were fear, so intense it gained shape, sound, and breath. When sleep became a luxury too dangerous to claim, people began to understand that only those with extraordinary strength of body or mind could survive the black storm. And from within those sleepless nights, people started noticing a strange group, those who never got sick or who fell ill and mysteriously recovered, as if their bodies held something different, a secret no one in that era could explain. After countless sleepless nights, after the groans, the coughing, after the tolling of the death bell striking the walls like hammer blows against steel, the city began to notice something strange. Some people did not die, not because they avoided the sick, not because they stayed away from danger. They lived right in the middle of it. They walked through it every day. They touched the sick, breathed the same air, slept in rooms thick with the stench of death, and yet they remained standing. At first, people thought it was luck. Then, they thought it was a blessing. But as the number of dead skyrocketed while those few still did not fall, Surprise turned into a mixture of curiosity and fear. Why were they alive? The question spread like a whisper of wind, quiet, persistent, unanswered. There were frail old men living in cramped houses where rats scurried, freely, where smoke and vinegar were never enough to mask the sickly air. And yet they stayed healthy. There were mothers who nursed their feverish children for days, holding them as they groaned, letting their burning breath wash over their necks. But when the child died, the mother still stood, eyes red, body untouched by illness. There were grave diggers, body carriers, and the men who pushed corpse carts every day. Their hands touched cold flesh, their clothes soaked up blood. Sometimes they even slept beside stiffened bodies simply because there was no more space. And yet, each morning, they rose again and continued their work, breathing heavily from fatigue, not from disease. In the city, they were called by many names: the chosen, the blessed, stone flesh, untouched shadow, the rider who does not fall. But when people looked at them, all they saw were ordinary humans, too ordinary, standing outside every explanation their age could offer. A thin, skeletal child, pale from hunger, was still running in the yard of an abandoned house to pick up bits of wood, while beside him lay the body of his mother waiting for the corpse cart. The child coughed a little from the cold, then fell silent, and continued running as if wrapped in an invisible shield. An older woman living beside a graveyard, where bells tolled every hour, where the air was heavier with death than anywhere else. Every day she opened her door, burned a small handful of herbs, breathed deeply, and began cooking porridge for whatever neighbors were still alive. She watched them come, watched them cough, watched them collapse, watched them leave on the wooden cart. And yet she stood strong like an oak in a storm. A physician who refused to wear the bird-beaked mask because he couldn't bear the smell of herbs inside it. He entered homes with his bare face, bare hands. He was not afraid. No one understood why he felt no fear. And, strangely, the disease did not touch him. He lived so long that people believed a divine hand rested on his shoulder as he worked. At times, the survivors themselves wondered, "Why am I still here? What is different in my body from those who have passed? What in my blood is fighting what is killing the entire city?" But they found no answer. And that silence made them feel both pride and fear. For some time, surviving in a sea of the dead felt like a curse. Survivors looked around, families gone, friends lost, neighbors' houses empty. They walked the streets as if moving through an open graveyard. Some survived so long they began avoiding other people's eyes, afraid of being seen as monsters, afraid someone would ask the questions they could not answer. Others became objects of suspicion. Why hasn't he died? What has he taken? What does he know that we don't? Is he carrying something dangerous inside him? These whispers slipped through shuttered houses, drifting from one fearful mouth to another like a small rat, running through the alleys. Yet, despite the fear, people clung to the survivors as if to the last thread of hope. If they can live, then there is still a chance for us. That fragile hope kept the city from collapsing completely. Some records mention strange stories. A mother on the verge of death, lying in agony. Her daughter, still healthy, held her all night, pressing her cheek to her mother's as if trying to lend her life. After 2 days, the mother recovered. The girl remained uninfected. People called her the spared child. No one understood what invisible strength protected her. Then, there were those who survived not by strength, but by accident, through circumstances no one had considered. Some lived in damp basements where rats seldom ventured. Some lived near kitchens where heat and smoke unknowingly drove fleas away. Some never left their houses during the entire plague, living off dusty jars of old food. And no one ever visited them, not even the disease. No one knew who survived by luck, who by strong constitution, who by avoiding fleas without meaning to, who by faith, who by divine intervention. Everything blurred together in uncertainty. But whatever the reason, their existence proved one thing: the plague could not destroy everyone. There would always be those who remained standing after the storm. And these people would become the foundation of what came after, when society collapsed, when craftsmen disappeared, when fields were abandoned. These survivors would be the ones to rebuild from the ruins, from the haunting memories of an age of horror. But before society could be rebuilt, it first had to fall. When the first survivors finally emerged, when they stepped out of the houses sealed for weeks to breathe in the unfamiliar air, not clean, not warm, but painfully empty, they suddenly realized a silent truth. The society around them had collapsed, not with an explosion, not with an earthquake or a war. It had collapsed through silence, through the gradual disappearance of the people who once filled every corner, every market stall, every stone street. There were mornings when people opened their doors and saw the city like a gigantic skeleton, the outer shell intact, but the life inside rotted away. Shops that had once bustled with crowds now stood with shattered windows, dangling roofs, and dishes scattered across the floor as if thrown by an invisible hand. The stables were empty, kitchens cold. Bakeries were still dusted with flour on the tables, but no one to knead dough, no one to light the ovens. The fields outside the city lay gray-yellow in the sun, with no farmers tending them, only the wind rustling through the grass like the earth itself was sighing. Craftsmen had died in droves, cart pullers were dead, tax collectors were dead, bakers were dead, coopers were dead, farmers were dead, teachers were dead. Without people, work itself vanished like flocks of birds scattered by a storm, never returning. And when the work vanished, the order vanished with it. Survivors walked the streets, hearing their own footsteps echo like in an abandoned house. No morning market noise, no children are laughing, no voices calling across the street. Each step felt like walking into a new era, an era where humans had to rediscover their place in a world that no longer resembled the one they knew. The remaining diaries described scenes like these. I walked through the market where I used to buy bread each morning. Now there were only overturned tables, broken wooden carts, and a pair of sandals lying in the street with no clue where the owner had gone. The unraveling did not happen with screams. It happened in the absence of human sound. Families who fled the city never returned. Abandoned fields remained untended. Small villages stood without guards. The entire land sank into a prolonged coma, as if the world had momentarily forgotten its own existence. But society did not only collapse, it shifted. When the dead became too numerous for the soil to hold, when layers of people vanished like winter leaves, the survivors began to notice vast empty spaces. More abandoned land than cultivated fields, more empty homes than inhabited ones. Roles once considered prestigious suddenly stood vacant. Survivors, once farmers, carpenters, cart pullers, even beggars, became as valuable as gold. Land that had belonged to nobles could no longer be worked unless they hired at higher wages or simply gave it away. Commoners could now own fields, houses, and jobs they had never dared to dream of months earlier. Cooks became rare treasures, market keepers were respected, healers were revered like miracles. Blacksmiths, coopers, carpenters, any who still lived became pillars of the new world. Society began to rearrange itself, not through laws or decrees, but through the sheer need to survive. Many landlords granted easier terms to farmers. Many poor families owned their first home. Many people found better work because there was no one left to compete with. The world was being rebuilt from the beginning, raw, trembling, but full of unprecedented possibilities. In this emptiness, human relationships shifted too. Survivors began seeing one another as the remaining fragments of a great painting torn apart. They shared what little food they had. They rebuilt small market stalls. They lit fires in the town square so people could gather, not to celebrate, but simply to feel they weren't alone. Some days, small groups gathered to put up a village notice board again. They pinned trembling lines of handwriting, "If you are alive, come here. If you need help, leave a mark. If you are searching for loved ones, write their names." The papers fluttered in the wind, like the combined cry and call of a society learning to walk again from its own ruins. Not everything was good. Fear, doubt, and grief lingered. But amid the ashes, people began finding one, another again. They shared survival stories. They shared sorrow. And in these stories they realized if they had survived the worst, then everything after could be rebuilt. Some churches opened their doors again. The bells rang not to announce death, but to call the living together, to share food, to rebuild homes. It was the first time in many months that the bells no longer evoked fear. They became a sound of rebirth. The survivors, though carrying wounds that would never fully heal, began sowing the first seeds into abandoned fields. They did not know if the seeds would sprout, but they planted them anyway, because it was the only way to tell themselves that life had not ended. And each evening, when the sun dipped low and cast orange light across the weathered rooftops, the survivors looked at one another and silently thought, "We are still here. We can rebuild, and we will live on." Hope, small as a fragile sprout pushing through blackened soil, was still hope. And in an age swallowed almost entirely by darkness, that small thing had more power than any weapon humanity had ever forged. Even though society had begun its hesitant reconstruction, even though survivors had found one another again, even though the death bells no longer rang with the same relentless frequency, the darkness of the plague did not vanish. It lingered, not only in the abandoned streets, the empty fields, the shuttered homes, but within the very sleep of those who survived. No one spoke of it, yet everyone felt it. The plague still lived inside their minds, even when their eyes were closed. The nights without groans or bells were not peaceful. People lay down after a day of rebuilding, trying to adjust to their new lives. But when darkness slipped across their rooms, their minds opened a different door, a door leading to a realm no one could control: dreams. And in that realm, the Black Death lived on. Some dreamed of running through the old city, once bustling, now hollow like a massive skull. The wind moaned through abandoned homes, mimicking the sounds of those long, wretched nights. They ran for someone, anyone, but found no one. They called out loved ones' names, but only cold echoes answered. Whenever they turned back, they saw their own doors sealed shut, exactly as they had been in the worst days of the plague. And then they woke up, heart pounding, hands damp with sweat, even though their actual home was quiet and warm. Some dreamed of being chased, not by someone, not even by something identifiable. Just footsteps behind them, soft, steady, right at their ear. Sometimes the thing chasing them didn't run, it only walked, yet it approached with the speed of wind slipping through a crack in the wall. They ran across wooden bridges, through stone streets, past deserted markets, then slipped, fell, and woke gasping as if they had escaped the scythe of death itself. Some dreamed of being buried alive in a mass grave. The air is thick, the soil was crushing their chest like the sky collapsing on them. They heard shovelfuls of dirt dropping, a rhythmic heavy thud, each one like a drum pounding against their spine. In the dream, they tried to raise a hand, tried to open their mouth to call someone's name, but their arms wouldn't move, and their mouth was full of dirt. When they woke, they found their hands clutching their chest, dragging in air, eyes wide like someone who had just climbed out of a grave. Some dreamed of loved ones returning, not in a frightening way, but in a way that shattered their hearts. A mother saw her child sitting by the bed, eyes wide, the way they had been when alive. A husband saw his wife tending the hearth, turning back to smile. A child saw his father knocking on the door, calling his name in that warm, familiar voice, and every time they reached out to touch them, the figures dissolved into mist. They woke to soaked sleeves and the cruel truth reclaiming its place. Those they loved were truly gone. Dreams, instead of being a refuge, turned into a realm of echoes, where fear and longing merged into shifting shapes with no clear boundaries. Some dreamed only blackness, so deep it felt like being swallowed by the void. Some dreamed of bells they thought they had forgotten. The bells didn't ring like before. They rang inside their heads, the echo of an era refusing to leave. Yet not all dreams were terrifying. Among the nightmares were a few dreams like candles in the darkness, small but warm enough to soften weary hearts. Some saw themselves standing in a barren field, while the sun rose slowly behind a thin veil of fog. The light was gentle, not hot, splintering into golden glass over the earth. They heard birds returning, wind brushing over tender new grass. No screams, no groans, no bells. only the stillness of a morning after the storm. Some dreamed of a revived city, the market reopened, laughter echoing, warm bread on tables, children running across the road. Everything was thin as smoke, yet so beautiful it made them smile in their sleep. When they awoke, they felt as though they had drunk a sip of cool water after days of thirst. Some dreamed of walking hand in hand with a stranger, perhaps another survivor, across roads still coated in the dust of lost time. They did not speak, only walked, yet the presence of another soul in the dream was enough to quiet the loneliness. These dreams appeared rarely, tiny islands in a black ocean, but whenever they came, they reassured people that their minds were healing, that darkness could not fill every corner of the heart. During the day, no one spoke of them, but at night, when candlelight flickered, when the wind seeped through narrow cracks, when breathing grew heavy, people slipped back into their dreams, where lost things and new beginnings intertwined. Dreams became an extension of their lives, half lived in daylight, half lived in darkness, and both halves, whether painful or beautiful, proved that humanity had not surrendered its will to live. But the terror in their dreams was only part of the story. For when dreams began to shift, when survivors began waking with a new longing to leave the city, they faced a new choice: to run. When the night's dreams became mirrors reflecting fear and the fragile remnants of humanity, when the city had grown so silent that people used the silence itself to measure time, a new desire began to slip into every mind: to leave. Not everyone dared say it, but everyone thought it. When the morning light slipped through half-sealed cracks in the shutters and fell upon empty rooms, the people realized they no longer belonged to this city. It had once been home, once filled with laughter, market cries, the rumble of wagon wheels on stone. Now it was only a shell, beautiful but hollow, upright but dead. Long streets, shuttered windows, ownerless homes, all felt like memories that had rotted from within. And human beings who cannot endure stillness for too long began seeking a way out. Families who chose to flee often prepared the night before. No lamps, no loud voices. They gathered what remained: hard bread, water, a few clothes, a scraggly rope. Only the smallest, lightest things, whatever they could carry on a journey whose length no one could guess. No one slept that night. They sat together and listened to the city breathe its last fragile breaths. Wind seeped through wooden roofs, gentle but cold as winter fingers brushing the back of the neck. Before sunrise, when the sky was still bruised purple, they silently opened their doors and stepped into the street. And they were not alone. Along the long stone road leading to the city gate, other figures appeared. A family of 3, a group of 5, a mother with 2 children, a lone man, neighbors they had assumed dead. All emerged into the gray dawn like shadows peeling themselves away from a ruined painting. No one greeted anyone. No one spoke. But they recognized one another by the gaze, that silent look shared by people who carried the same fear. In the dim light of dawn, the line of refugees moved forward, footsteps soft, steady, neither hurried nor slow. The only clear sounds were the sobs of thirsty children, the muted cough of an elder, the rustle of cloth as someone clutched their small bundle of belongings. The city gate hung open, not to send them off, but because the last guard had abandoned his post long ago. The city no longer had the strength to control who entered or left. It had grown too tired, too spent, and simply let everything drift with the wind. As they crossed the threshold, they heard the wind beyond the fields blow stronger. That wind felt freer, wider, but also more terrifying. It carried with it the sense that they were stepping out of human territory and into a wilderness where every step could mean life or death. The road out of the city was covered in dead leaves, yellow, brown, black, brittle as cinders. Underfoot they crumbled into tiny fragments, producing a mournful crackling sound. The forest ahead was dense and dark, like a long tunnel carved out of shadow. But it was still hope, because behind them lay certain death. Ahead of them, however murky, still lay a chance. At first they walked in silence. Then, like every long journey, Silence broke into the cries of thirsty children. A mother soothed her little one with a hoarse whisper, her voice shredded by too many sleepless nights. A man coughed so violently he had to sit down, clutching his chest. Others looked at him, then turned away, unwilling to approach, not out of cruelty, but because their own lives hung in the balance. Some stretches of the road felt endless, uneven ground, stones tumbling from hillsides, wind sharp enough to pierce bone. The deeper they went into the forest, the more the city's sounds faded. No more bells, no more wind against rooftops, no more footsteps of those following behind. Only rustling leaves, snapping branches, and the heavy breathing of survivors. Sometimes in the quiet, they heard birdsong. The sound startled the entire group. Someone whispered, "It's been so long since we heard birds." And that tiny sound made them believe the world still contained something untouched by plague. But the journey held no shortage of hardship. Some families collapsed along the way. A mother, carrying her child, sank to her knees beside the road, folding like a branch broken by the wind. An old man fell and never rose again. His companions laid him under a tree, covered him with a cloak, and moved on. No time for graves, no strength for tears. Their last gift to him was silence. Some looked back toward the fading silhouette of the city and realized they were escaping more than sickness. They were escaping memory. And memory, strangely enough, clung even tighter than the plague-borne fleas. At night, the group rested at the forest's edge. They built fires from fallen branches, the flames casting trembling light across their faces, thin, exhausted, hollow-eyed, but illuminated by something indescribable. They were alive. Children huddled together for warmth. Adults leaned against tree trunks, eyes closed but never fully asleep. The fire crackled like the forest whispering to them. And for the first time in weeks, someone murmured, "Tomorrow, we will keep going." It was not a strong voice, not a confident one, but it was the voice of someone who still hoped. The refugees who fled the city were not cowards running away. They were people who still believed in tomorrow, people who walked forward though every step might be their last, people who carried fear, pain, and memories, yet also life, the one thing the Black Death had tried to take but could never fully claim. And when dawn poured its pale gold light across the forest and dew melted on the leaves, they stood again, took each other's hands, and continued down the long road that led nowhere known. But strangely, not knowing was less frightening than staying. Even if danger lay ahead, they walked. Even if the forest was cold and steep, they walked. Even if behind them was a dead city and ahead only a fragile thread of hope, they walked. And in those steps, leaving the city, a new feature of the plague era emerged. Improvised architecture of survival, small fortresses built by instinct as people sought places to shelter. As waves of fleeing survivors slipped out of the dying city, those who remained were not heroes. They were simply people who could not leave. Some were too weak. Some were tied to those who were still breathing but fading fast. Others believed that running into the unknown would only deliver them to a slower death. And so, trapped inside the ribcage of a city that had already stopped breathing, they did the only thing their instincts allowed. They built defenses. Not fortresses of stone or steel, but desperate shelters, warped, claustrophobic, improvised from panic and hope. Houses that once felt spacious now shrank like lungs collapsing from within. The air, already thick with vinegar and the bite of burning herbs, grew heavier with each passing hour. Windows were smothered with waxed cloth, with planks, with whatever scrap metal could be found. The front doors, once symbols of hospitality, were barricaded with 2, 3, sometimes 4 wooden beams, not against thieves, but against the wind. The wind itself had become an enemy. They believed it carried death. Inside these airtight boxes, 10 steps were exhausting. A deep breath felt like drowning in slow motion. Adults learned to breathe in shallow sips of air, like prisoners trapped beneath rubble. Many nights someone would jolt awake, gasping, convinced the walls were closing in. It wasn't real, but their beating heart said otherwise. People began sealing everything: door cracks, stuffed with cloth, keyholes, plugged with beeswax, roof gaps, patched with coarse fabric. The more desperate they became, the more airtight the houses grew. The more airtight they grew, the more the houses became traps. Each home turned into a wooden box filled with bodies, breath, and fear that had nowhere to go. When the sun rose, light could not enter. Rooms slipped into a perpetual dusk, glowing only with candlelight, dim, fluctuating, casting shadows that draped over faces like invisible burial veils. In this gloom, people strained to hear anything from the outside: a footstep, a whisper, a scrape. Even the faintest sound could send shivers across a room. Was it a human, a rat, or something else they feared even more? The cramped space made children cry more often, but crying was dangerous. Mothers pressed trembling hands over tiny mouths, whispering, "Hush, my love, hush, don't let it hear us." No one knew what "it" meant: the plague, fear, or something coiled deep within their own minds. Many households created makeshift isolation rooms, a corner near the back of the home, shrouded behind heavy sheets of waxed cloth, where the sick lay, breathing the air everyone else feared. The cloth stuck to fingers, to hair, to clothing. It thickened the atmosphere like humidity in a tomb. Anyone entering that curtained space felt as though they had stepped into the underworld, where each breath tasted like rot and dread fused together. Caring for the sick meant leaning into that suffocating darkness, touching fevered skin, inhaling the scent of despair. Hearts pounded not from infection, but from the overwhelming subterranean terror of the confined space. Every home built more walls. Some found old planks, some tore apart bed frames, some stacked branches and crates, barriers within barriers, defensive layers they called them, separating sleeping spaces from food spaces, candle spaces from sick spaces. But each added wall made the home smaller. Each smaller home tightened the air, and the tighter the air became, the larger the fear grew, swelling like a creature crouched in the center of the room, waiting to strike. At night, the houses became cocoons. The heat rose, wax burned. Herb smoke clung to rafters, hair, clothes. Every breath landed heavily, echoing like a rusted bellows. Some people swore they lived inside the stomach of a beast, a giant creature digesting them with each humid exhale. Tensions simmered and broke. Arguments erupted over a crack in the window that was left open too wide. Families splintered over whether to build more walls or tear them down to breathe. Worst of all were the night panics, when someone jolted upright, screaming that they couldn't breathe, that the walls were squeezing their ribs, that someone had to open the door. Now. But opening the door meant death. And so, the family clung to the panicked person, holding them down, rocking them as if soothing a child, whispering through trembling lips, "It's all right. It's all right. Breathe slow. We're alive. We're still alive." It wasn't reassurance. It was a prayer. Strangely, from these suffocating chambers, something unexpected emerged: communication. The houses were sealed so tightly that people used the walls to speak. One tap, the house next door tapped back. Two taps in response. Primitive Morse code, like messages exchanged between cells of a prison. It was not a conversation, it was existence. We are here. We are alive. And somehow, that faint knocking, small as a heartbeat against wood, tethered them to one another. Despite the suffocation, despite the dread, these makeshift fortresses saved lives. No one would ever believe that a cramped, smoky, candlelit box could serve as a sanctuary, but it did. It kept out rats, it kept out fleas, it kept out the wind, the cold, and the invisible death that drifted through the city. Inside these oppressive shells, people survived, barely, but enough. And from that suffocation, tiny communities were born, clusters of homes, clusters of survivors, clusters of people signaling through walls, through tapping, through flickers of candlelight and pieces of wood rapping softly against the floor. And from those fragile signals, from those muffled exchanges within sealed houses, villages began to rise again, organizing themselves to survive. After endless days trapped inside their suffocating barricaded homes, after countless nights trembling beside a single flickering candle, people slowly began to realize a brutal truth. They could not survive by shrinking into themselves forever. Wooden walls, waxed cloth, herbs, and vinegar might keep the infected wind outside, but they could not shield anyone from the cold reality that no human can endure true isolation for long. And then, softly, slowly, the tiny signals tapped between the walls began to take shape as a new form of life. At first it was only a faint knock. 1 tap, we're still alive. 2 taps, we need water. 3 taps, the next house is safe. At first, signals. Later, language. Silent calls, small gestures, pieces of wood scratched with urgent messages and slipped through cracks. All of it slowly became the vocabulary of a shadow community surviving together in the dark. And something changed. Fragile, slow, but undeniable. Inside their sealed chambers, people began to feel something they had forgotten existed. They were not completely alone. Even without opening their doors, without seeing another face, they knew the house next door still had breath inside it. The suffocating pressure in the air, the heaviness that clamped down on their chests like stone, began to lift. Not much, but enough for hearts to stop pounding with panic every few minutes. Then, one cold morning, as the sun barely lifted its pale head over the gray hills, a strange sound echoed down a narrow alley. A door sliding open. Not fully, just a sliver. But a family that had been sealed inside their home for weeks cracked open their door to see. No one stepped out, but that crack of light was enough to send a message through the entire neighborhood. It's time to do more than simply survive. In the days that followed, more doors began to open, just a hand's width. Not enough for the wind to slip in, just enough for eyes to peek out, for hands to pass or receive something small. One family slid a handful of leftover seeds to the house beside them. In return, they received a piece of hardened bread, shaking hands, nervous eyes. But in exchange, a connection, and something extraordinary happened. A tiny spark of hope slid between the acid scent of vinegar, the fumes of wax, and the breath of weary survivors. The more doors cracked open, the clearer the community became. Small groups formed quietly. Women who still had strength gathered to maintain fires in homes where the woodpile had run out. Men took on the grim task of removing bodies from the neighborhood, realizing that if corpses stayed indoors, the whole block would die with them. Others were responsible for rationing water, rare, precious, more valuable than gold. No rules, no leaders, no speeches, just survival, transforming itself into cooperation. And the startling truth was, this cooperation wasn't born from joy. It was born from fear, but fear that pulled people together instead of tearing them apart. Shadows moved through back passageways behind homes, avoiding the larger roads, but searching for one another through the familiar code of taps on walls. They used baskets lowered by rope through windows to pass food, used strings tied to bottles of water to slide supplies from house to house, used symbols placed outside their doors, a stone, a cloth, a dried twig, to signal their status. The air was still thick, but no longer thick with lonely terror. It was thick with the shared breath of many, cramped, suffocating, but alive. As days passed, cooperation grew into structure, quiet, instinctive structure. People divided themselves into roles without ever speaking a word aloud. 1. The burial group. Those stronger and braver collected corpses from each home, carrying them to a crude burial ground on the outskirts. It was a hideous, back-breaking job, but it kept the death stench from pooling between their homes. 2. The foragers. A handful dared to step into the old marketplace, searching abandoned storerooms and looted houses for stray sacks of grain. Whatever they found, they shared. No one hoarded anything. 3. The caretakers. Those who had survived the plague, bodies marked but immune, took on the sacred duty of tending the sick. They entered infected rooms without fear. They became the quiet heroes of the neighborhood, needing no titles, just the steady rise and fall of their breath each morning. 4. The Guardians. They watched the perimeter at night, not for thieves, but to keep crows and rats from overwhelming the streets. Each person contributed, and a small miracle happened. The number of dead began to fall. Not to zero, but lower, steadier. And in the roaring darkness of the Black Death, that was nothing short of a miracle. On rare afternoons when sunbeams slipped through cracks in the walls, people stood behind their doors and watched shadows moving outside, shadows of their neighbors still alive, still fighting. No one spoke, but the message was clear. We are alive, together. And then came one extraordinary day, a day preserved in several old accounts. A child ran from one house to another, ran without coughing, without fever, without collapsing. The child clutched a small piece of bread someone had gifted and laughed, the first laughter in months. That sound pierced the thick shroud of death like a needle through cloth, a sliver of light so thin it could have been a crack in the air itself. But everyone saw it. And in that moment, tiny and fragile as it was, wrapped in the smells of vinegar, wax, and ash, people remembered what it felt like to be human. They began to believe that if they could knock on walls for each other, if they could pass bits of bread, if they could dig graves together, then they could endure this hell together. And that belief, though faint, lifted them, like a candle that refuses to die in the heart of a storm. But as the small community steadied itself, a new threat emerged: rumors. Rumors needed no fleas, no rats, no wind, only mouths and fear, which in those days was as plentiful as cold night air. As the small, fragile communities began to steady themselves behind their makeshift walls, as the tapping on wooden boards shifted from a code of fear into a faint pulse of connection, a new enemy slipped silently through the cracks. Rumors. No one saw them, no one heard their footsteps. But they entered, soft as breath, swift as drifting smoke, and no less deadly than the plague-bearing fleas. In an age where people lived in fear and secrecy, where every house was a sealed fortress and sunlight itself was filtered through layers of cloth and timber, rumors became the one thing that could seep through every barrier. They needed no gate, no path, no logic, only fear, and in those days, fear was as plentiful as the cold night air. The first rumor arrived as a whisper sliding through a wall. Someone poisoned the well. No one knew where it came from, which house, which person. But by late afternoon, it had sliced through the whole neighborhood like a thin blade slipping through wood. A mother boiling water froze, then dumped the entire pot. An old man, halfway through a cup, gagged and spit it out, shaking violently. A young man slammed the well cover shut and barred it with a plank, as if a murderer stood right behind him. One sentence, faceless, sourceless, sent an entire community spiraling. That night, no one dared drink water. The cries of thirsty children echoed through the narrow alleys, soft but sharper than the groans of the dying. Mothers whispered, voices ragged with exhaustion, "Sleep. Tomorrow I'll find different water." But they knew there was no different water. The second rumor hit harder, faster. The house at the end of the alley is calling demons. A sentence like a needle stabbing into hearts already crushed under darkness. Logic should have been stronger. Who had strength left to summon demons? But in desperation, logic is the first thing to break. Suspicion crept along the walls like a shadow. Some families tapped the walls, not to check in, but to warn. The house at the end of the alley, though innocent, suddenly became a stain in everyone's imagination. Mothers pulled their children away from that side of the wall. Fathers added another wooden bar across their doors. No one sent food there anymore. Isolation sometimes was crueler than death. Then came the rumor more dangerous than fleas. Someone is hiding the sickness. Nothing terrified survivors more than the idea that someone among them carried death silently. So every cough, even one caused by dust, could be turned into an accusation. One cough, one sharp breath, one voice saying, "I heard noises from that house last night." And entire streets sealed themselves tighter, shoving more cloth into cracks, dripping more wax along the edges. Rumors turned houses into fortresses. not against the plague, but against each other. The whispers kept spreading, seeping like water through soil, like fog through a forest, colorless, scentless, but cold enough to raise the dead. Then another rumor, freezing as winter. Someone brought the sickness from outside. Immediately, the entrance to the neighborhood was barricaded with thick planks. Guards were posted, not to protect, but to keep people out. A traveler begging for shelter was ignored, avoided, shunned. The rumor tightened its invisible fist around everyone's compassion. Then came strange, half-superstitious whispers. There's a house where no one died. They must have done something unnatural. In any sane world, survival should be a blessing. But rumor twisted it into suspicion. Ash and mud were smeared on that household's door, an unspoken curse, a mark of exile. Yet all of it was nothing more than wind moving through a world where reason had no place left to stand. The more rumors spread, the quieter the neighborhood became, a silence thick enough to feel on the skin, a silence with edges sharp as broken glass. People watched one another's shadows through the slits of their shutters, haunted, weary, distrustful. And worst of all, the whispers made humans turn their backs on each other, something even the plague itself had not fully accomplished. But amid the toxic fog of rumors, a tiny, fragile beauty emerged. Some people refused to succumb. They tapped the walls to comfort a neighbor after hearing a cough. They slipped food in secret to families being shunned. They dared to crack open their doors and slide a crust of bread or a bowl of water toward those isolated by suspicion. These acts were small, embers glowing in a pile of cold ash, but even one ember is enough to ignite hope. And as people reflected on their losses, they began to understand. It wasn't rumors that were killing them, but the fear that fed those rumors like a blade sharpened in darkness. Yet even in all this chaos, humanity clung to one final necessity, something far more important than gossip, more essential than suspicion, the ritual before sleep. Not a ritual of peace, not a ritual of comfort, but a ritual to keep death itself at bay in the night. In an age where darkness claimed half of every day, where people lived sealed inside their homes with no air left to spare, where even the sound of their own breathing was enough to jolt them awake, sleep became a luxury. Not because they weren't tired, everyone was exhausted to the bone, but because every time they closed their eyes, they feared they might never open them again. The plague didn't only kill during the day, it killed at night, quietly, while the breath weakened, while the body sagged, while the mind hovered somewhere between dream and waking. And so, to guard themselves against that silent death, people created nightly rituals, not because they believed they truly worked, but because they needed something to cling to. The first ritual was hanging herbs on the door. As soon as the sun slipped behind the hills and the first candle was lit, families gently tied small bundles of sage, rosemary, and juniper to the doorframe. The dried leaves rustled faintly in the draft, a sound so soft only a child with its ear pressed to the wood might notice. But to adults, that thin whisper was like a lullaby. You're safe here. You're safe here. Each leaf, each twig intertwined with the next, trembling as though keeping watch over the night. The thick scent of herbs, smoke, and vinegar blended together, settling into the air like an invisible blanket stretched across the doorway, not to block the disease, but to block the fear. Beside the herbs hung small metal charms. Some were carved with ancient symbols, others were nothing more than scrap metal hammered thin. When they shifted and tapped each other in the night, their faint clink echoed like a distant church bell, thin, cold, yet strangely comforting, as if someone far away was keeping vigil over them. That sound, mixed with the wind, became the strange nighttime music of the plague, hollow, eerie, but soothing enough to help the mind loosen its grip. Another ritual, burning herbs before lying down. When the candle had burned halfway, someone in the family would carefully set a pinch of sage or rosemary aflame in a small clay bowl. White smoke rose in curling ribbons, tracing shapes like miniature ghosts above the bed. Someone would gently waft the bowl around the room, around the sealed windows, around the place where the children slept. The smoke cured nothing. but it transformed the cramped room into a space suspended between dream and reality, a place where the boundary between life and death blurred just enough to make sleep feel possible. Some families also whispered prayers at night, not aloud. They feared a strong voice would pull the wind in. They whispered so quietly only the person beside them could hear. The prayers wove themselves into the crackle of candle wax, the soft clinking of charms, the sighing wind brushing the roof. All together they formed a strange symphony, bleak, muted, but oddly warm, a thin, invisible quilt laid over weary hearts. And then, when every ritual was complete, when the herbs were hung, the charms placed, the smoke lifted, the prayers murmured, the family lay down together. They usually slept pressed close, as if the warmth of another body were the last surviving shield. Their breaths mingled. The steady heartbeat of the one beside them reminded them that they were not alone in the dark. But perhaps the strongest ritual of all wasn't the herbs or the charms. It was the small, fragile belief they forced themselves to hold before closing their eyes. A mother placing her trembling hand on her child's forehead, a father checking the door one final time, an old man staring at the ceiling, telling himself silently, "I survived today. May I survive tomorrow." And this tiny, wavering belief, repeated night after night like a secret prayer, carried them into sleep. Not peaceful sleep, but the sleep of exhausted warriors who knew they must wake at dawn to keep living. On calmer nights, the children fell asleep first. They curled up like small cats, their breathing soft and even. Adults watched them, and for a moment, something in their hearts softened. If the children could sleep, then perhaps the world had not entirely ended. But there were nights when the herbs burned too quickly, when the candle flickered wrong, when the wind clawed at the roof, and ravens cried in the distance. Those were the nights when no one dared sleep deeply. They lay on their sides, ears sharp, listening to every sound, the wind, the shifting wood, the scurry of rats on the tiles, and the coughing from a neighboring home. When they heard that cough, a mother would grip her child closer, as if the sound might seep through the wall. No matter how many rituals they performed, everyone knew that sleep during these times was a gamble, but no one could stay awake forever. And so they let the rituals, these thin threads of faith, carry them through the night. Sometimes people awoke suddenly, not because of any noise, but because of silence. And strangely, silence was often more frightening than chaos. But in those rare pockets of calm, people began to realize these small rituals were the reason they hadn't collapsed. Herbs could not stop death, charms could not, smoke could not, prayers could not, but they kept the spirit standing, and sometimes, in a plague, spirit was stronger than any medicine. As these nightly rituals became a part of survival, another truth emerged, one so cruel no one wanted to admit it. Survival depended not only on who had the best charms or the finest herbs, but on who was rich and who was poor. And so, in the darkness, a painful question began to take shape. Who lived longer, the wealthy or the poor? In an age where darkness swallowed entire streets, where the breath of the sick drifted into the wind as an invisible warning, and where even sleep became a gamble between life and death, people began to ask a bitter, ruthless question that no one could avoid. Who had a better chance of surviving, the rich or the poor? It was a question with no simple answer, because the plague didn't choose its victims by their wealth. But the conditions people lived in, the things built over generations, acted like an invisible hand, pushing some toward life and others toward death. In the great manors, nobles lived behind thick stone walls, high windows, and airy rooms. They had fragrant herbs, chests of food, wine, vinegar, medicines. They had servants, private physicians, maybe not the best, but at least ones who had survived long enough. Yet the truth, sharp and cold, was that even they were not safe. A large house had many rooms, but also many doors. Wide doors meant easy drafts. High walls could still be climbed by rats. Gorgeous halls filled with footsteps also meant more servants, more movement, more chances for disease. A single crack in the polished machinery of wealth was enough for sickness to seep in like poisonous mist. And so, many magnificent estates became silent tombs. Golden candlelight flickered against stone walls, but illuminated only pale, sunken faces. Footsteps echoed across marble floors, only to deliver another body to the courtyard. Wealth could not shield anyone completely. But the rich still had undeniable advantages. They had more food, more space, more herbs, and most importantly, they had the choice to leave. Many noble families fled the city before the plague reached its peak. They left in carriages, bringing servants, trunks of clothes, leather bags of dry bread, clean water, herbs. Their wheels rolled slowly down the dirt roads, leaving behind the cries, the bells, the slamming doors of the poor. To the poor, it was an obvious injustice, like a lantern at the end of the street that only burned for those who could afford the oil. But leaving wasn't always the path to survival. The roads were filled with forests, with bandits, with roaming disease. Countless carriages vanished without ever reaching their destination. Many nobles died searching for safety. Some were robbed by starving travelers. Servants abandoned their masters on the road, fleeing into the woods. Luxury meant nothing on a journey that stripped everyone bare, until noble and beggar looked almost the same. Tired, scared, thirsty, cold, unsure of whom to trust. There were even records saying the wealthy sometimes died because of their own luxury, because they carried too much, took too long, and moved too slowly, and fell into the very storm they were trying to outrun. Meanwhile, the poor, with fewer possessions, fewer choices, fewer illusions, sometimes survived longer. They lived in small, cramped homes pressed together like a hive. Wooden walls kept warmth better than cold stone. Few windows meant fewer drafts. No servants coming and going meant less exposure. And most importantly, the poor were used to hardship, used to sickness, used to surviving with almost nothing. When the plague came, they didn't wait for physicians, didn't wait for help. They built makeshift barriers from cloth, burned herbs, rationed scraps, survived however they could. They did not panic because they had lived at the edge their whole lives. Farmers in the countryside had another advantage: natural isolation. Their homes stood in wide, empty fields where the wind blew strong. No one visited from the city. There were no crowded markets, no piles of waste, no rats scurrying between hundreds of houses. And so, in many small villages, the plague passed through with far fewer deaths than in the cities. Survivors later described something remarkable: entire poor families surviving together, while the noble family across the road was wiped out completely. Not pure luck, but because simplicity itself became a natural shield the wealthy had abandoned long ago. But do not misunderstand. The poor paid a heavy price. They had no medicine, little food, no one to care for them, and sometimes no hope. Many poor families died in the same tiny houses they had lived their whole lives in, not because their conditions were worse, but because when illness arrived, they had no layers of protection except their bare hands. In the end, when people looked back, they realized both rich and poor could live. Both rich and poor could die. Not because of money, but because of circumstance. Money could buy herbs, but not clean air. Poverty could create natural isolation, but not guarantee food. Every class had its own escape and its own trap. Yet in the midst of this contrast, a strangely beautiful and heartbreaking image appeared. Some wealthy families shared herbs with the poor. Some poor families shared clean water with the rich. Some nobles brought bread to craftsmen. Some craftsmen brought firewood to the cold manors of former masters. The plague shattered every barrier and softened them too. And when night fell, whether in a stone hall or a cramped wooden shack, people did the same thing. They slept together. Not out of tradition, but because it was the only way to remember they were not alone in the dark. As the sun dipped below the horizon, as the stone streets cooled to the temperature of ice, as the wind brushed over rooftops carrying the dry breath of the plague, people of that era understood one thing with painful clarity: night was their greatest enemy. The disease killed during the day, yes, but fear, cold, and loneliness killed at night. And among the countless ways people invented to survive, There was one method both primitive and tender, fragile yet powerful: sleeping together. No hearth had enough wood to burn through the night. No herb could keep a body warm for hours. No candle was large enough to hold back the creeping sense of isolation. But human warmth, that they still had, and they clung to it. Every night, after finishing their rituals against death, herbs on the door, charms under pillows, smoke drifting through the room, the family would quietly gather and press themselves close. The warmth of one body seeped into another, soft as groundwater flowing beneath hardened soil. They called it the living hearth, the only fire that never ran out. The father slept at the outer edge, back turned toward the door, forming a wall of flesh against the wind. The mother curled beside the children, her hand resting lightly on a small chest, feeling the rise and fall of breath. The children tangled their limbs together in a warm, chaotic knot. No one complained. No one asked for space. No one slept apart. Because as the warmth spread, they felt something herbs and charms could never give, the sense that they were breathing together, still alive, still here. In the dim glow, their breaths moved like tiny waves. One inhaled, another exhaled. The elderly breathed slowly, the children quickly. A rhythm imperfect, uneven, unmusical. Yet it was the only lullaby that helped them sleep. It was the lullaby of survival. Outside, the wind lashed against the walls. Mice skittered across the roof. Crows cried somewhere far off like voices calling from another world. But inside, the shared warmth softened every sound. It wrapped around them like a web of invisible threads, holding the night at bay. There were nights so cold the mother had to wrap both children in her arms, her hands trembling, not only from the chill but from fear. Yet when she heard their steady breaths, the fear melted, the way frost melts in candlelight. There were nights when the father lay awake, watching his family's shadows stretch across the wall, wondering whether he would still see those same shadows the next morning. But then a tiny hand, in sleep, rested on his shoulder, and his heart softened. Sometimes a single touch was enough to keep a person alive. For those who had already lost someone, sleeping together took on another meaning. Two survivors lying close, trying to preserve the last warmth in a house suddenly too big. When someone died, their absence left a cold gap on the sleeping mat, cold as a stone laid directly on the heart. Nothing could fill that gap except holding one another tighter. There are stories of families who gathered around a dying loved one, not wanting them to slip into the dark alone. They wrapped their arms around them, keeping their fading body warm. And sometimes, strangely, miraculously, the dying person clung to life through the night, not because of herbs, not because of charms, but because the warmth of those who loved them pulled them back from the edge, for one more night, and then another. In many poor homes, sleeping together was also a way to know who had made it through the night. The dead grew cold quickly. So at dawn, the first thing people did was reach out and touch one another. Warmth meant life. Cold meant goodbye. Children were usually the first to stir. They would wrap their tiny arms around whoever lay beside them. Mother is still here. Father's still here. You're still here. And that single word, still, was enough to carry them through another day, even as the world outside continued to crumble. Old notes even describe a touching custom. Some surviving families dragged their beds closer and closer until all the beds touched, forming one large island of warmth. Bed beside bed, blanket over blanket, person beside person. A community not built to thrive, but built to endure together. People of that time called the act of sleeping together the night fire of the plague, not a fire of wood, but a fire of humanity. And on the coldest winter mornings, when the candles had burned out halfway through the night, families would wake to frost on the roof and discover something quietly beautiful. They were all still alive because of each other's warmth. But sleep in that era was never whole. No one rested from dusk till dawn. They woke in the middle of the night, checked the fire, checked their family, whispered prayers, then drifted back into slumber. It was what later generations would call broken sleep, a natural rhythm of survival. As people began sleeping together to fight the cold and the fear, They slowly noticed something strange. Their sleep was no longer seamless. No one slept straight from night until morning anymore. Instead, they woke in the middle of the night, as if their bodies had learned a new rhythm of survival during an age drowned in darkness. Nature has its own way of training humans, and in the plague years, it chose sleep as the lesson. Segmented sleep, something people of that time never named yet felt deeply, became a pattern. Half sleep, half wake, then sleep again. No one planned it, no one discussed it, no one taught it, yet everyone did it, as if the instinct had been carved into their bones. Night usually began with exhaustion and panic. Families lay pressed against one another, warmth blending into warmth, heartbeats gradually slowing. Candles melted into tiny pools of wax, releasing a faint scent like tree resin. Herbal smoke curled in slow, ghost-like spirals, hanging in the air like souls drifting between life and dream. And then, when the warmth had settled and fear stepped back a little, everyone slipped into the first sleep, a deep, heavy sleep, like the body had been freed of a weight it had carried all day. But a few hours later, as if awakened by some invisible clock, the entire neighborhood came alive again in silence. Every house stirred at its own time, but no matter rich or poor, every household opened its eyes in the middle of the night, not because of a loud noise, not because of a dream, but because their bodies knew they must wake. In the middle of the night, the house glowed faintly from the embers still alive in the hearth. The air felt colder. Wind tapped lightly on the roof. A cough from the neighboring house traveled through the wall, a voice from a parallel world. In that moment, people understood one truth clearly. The night did not belong entirely to sleep. It belonged to vigilance. Waking in the night, they tended to small but essential tasks. The father rose first, stirring the fading coals back to life. The crackle of igniting wood sounded soft but clear, like a new heartbeat for the house. That tiny flame was a reminder. We are still here. The mother checked on the children. She touched their foreheads, checking for heat. She placed her ear on their chests, listening for the steady thump of a living heart, a rhythm that proved the darkness had not claimed them during the night. The elders whispered prayers, not in clear voices, but in sounds soft as wind against a window. These prayers weren't pleas. They were anchors, keeping their minds from drifting too far into the shadows. A whispered line of prayer brought them back to themselves, like a rope pulling them ashore. Then, when each small duty was done, the house slowly settled again. The father returned to his place, pulling the blanket over his shoulders. The mother held her children closer. The elderly let out a quiet sigh, soft as a leaf touching water. And the second sleep began, not heavy like the first, lighter, dreamier, thinner, like a calm river flowing gently through the mind. Wind blended with breath, fire blended with heartbeat. Together, they became the soundtrack of the night. People of that era never knew segmented sleep was once an ancient human instinct. They only knew it helped them survive the night. A priest wrote, "Waking in the middle of the night is when the soul takes a walk, and when it returns, we sleep again." But in truth, it was simply the body's most primitive way of staying alive. People also used their midnight waking to listen to the neighborhood. A soft tap on the wall meant we're okay. A chair sliding gently meant someone rose and went back to bed. The faint clink of metal charms meant an elder had turned over. These tiny sounds formed a map of the living, a map every household learned to read in the dark. Of course, not all sounds were comforting. Some nights they heard strange noises, someone crying softly, pleading, whispering the name of the dead. But they never rushed over. They couldn't. They mustn't. They simply listened and prayed that the sound would fade into the night. Segmented sleep was not just a habit. It was a cycle of survival. The first sleep rested the body, the midnight waking protected the family. The second sleep restored the mind. And that cycle saved thousands. When dawn finally broke, the first slivers of light slipped through narrow cracks, weak but honest, like a quiet promise. We survived another night. People looked at one another through the pale morning glow, their breath still heavy with the remnants of darkness. But they smiled, a tired yet genuine smile. For in a world suffocated by plague, Waking in the night and falling asleep again was not a sign of disturbance. It was the sign of someone still fighting to live. And once they realized this, they began to cherish sleep, even when it brought nightmares, phantoms, and echoes of reality. Segmented sleep became the music of plague nights, the rhythm of breath, the rhythm of fear and hope woven together, the rhythm of a human heart accepting the darkness but refusing to bow to it. From within that strange sleep, people learned to care for one another, to listen, to endure. But no matter how hard they tried, one truth remained. Humans still needed small joys, fragile moments of comfort, to remind themselves that the world was not made only of death. In a time when even breathing became a luxury, when every night stretched on like an endless winter, when the tolling of death bells grew so frequent that people forgot what festival bells used to sound like, humanity stumbled upon a strange truth. Even in the deepest ruin, people still managed to find small luxuries to keep themselves alive. Not gold, not silk, not banquets, but tiny, fragile joys, just enough to soften the heart in the middle of a storm. And sometimes, those little luxuries help people live longer than any herb ever could. The first luxury, a hot meal. In that cold world, a bowl of steaming porridge was heaven. People called it fire in the belly, because just one sip sent warmth blooming through the stomach like a tiny miracle, making the whole body tremble with delight. Some days, the porridge was so thin that even scraping the spoon across the bottom couldn't find a single grain, yet they still smiled just watching the steam rise. A mother once wrote in her diary, "Today our family had hot porridge. It had nothing in it, but it was hot, and that alone made me feel richer than half the city." The second luxury, a cup of warm wine. Nights were so cold that bones practically rattled in protest, so anyone who still had a little alcohol hidden away treated it like treasure. A tiny cup, barely the size of a bottle cap, was enough to warm the cheeks pink. The elderly drank to warm their joints, the young drank to forget fear, and the exhausted drank for the courage to fall into a deep sleep. Sometimes the neighborhood even whispered a joke. 2 sips of wine are worth more now than the bishop's blessing. And they would giggle, soft, shaky giggles, but still laughter. A tiny spark of humor in the dark. The third luxury, a basin of warm herbal water. Bathing was almost a forgotten dream, but once in a while, if a family managed to save a bit of clean water and a few sprigs of herbs, they would heat up a small basin, just enough to soak hands, wash a face, or wipe down a cold body. As the steam rose, white and soft like newborn fog, the whole family felt human again. A child with a warm cloth brushing its cheeks once squealed in a whisper thin as birdsong slipping through the cracks, "Mom, it's warm, just like summer." Summer. They hadn't dared dream of summer in a long, long time. The fourth luxury, a scented candle. Someone had kept an amber-scented candle, a tiny extravagance no one cared about before the plague. But now, when lit, its gentle fragrance mingled with the smoke of herbs and beeswax, becoming a scent that loosened the tight knot in people's chests. Someone laughed when they sniffed the candle. "Wow, smells expensive." Just a small joke, but enough to make the whole house burst into quiet laughter. And in those days, laughter was more precious than medicine. The fifth, and most precious, luxury. A normal moment, like a father mending his child's shoes. A mother combing her daughter's hair with a broken-toothed comb. A child giggling at shadow puppets, dogs, birds, rabbits, dancing across the candlelit wall. Those moments, tiny as droplets, sometimes made adults want to cry because they realized everything they once took for granted had become a treasure. And perhaps the least obvious luxury was this: hearing someone else laugh. If, from the next house over, through thick-sealed walls, a faint laugh slipped out, even for a silly old story or a dropped bowl, the whole neighborhood would pause and listen. Not out of curiosity, but because that sound was beautiful proof that life still existed in a sea of death. The final luxury, hope. Hope wasn't an item. No one hung hope on the door. No one tucked hope beneath a pillow, but whenever a family had a hot meal, whenever a child was washed with warm water, whenever someone chuckled at the scent of a fancy candle, hope rose. It wasn't loud, it wasn't strong. It didn't blaze like fire. It was a tiny gleam, like the last sunbeam slipping through a dark cloud, like golden light glinting through a cracked roof tile. Yet that faint gleam kept people from sinking. And once people learned to find luxury in the middle of disaster, they slowly began to understand something else. Every catastrophe eventually retreats. Not in a day, not in a week, not through a miracle, but little by little. In the end, as the storm of plague slowly receded, people stepped out from their darkened homes, from behind their wooden barricades, from the panic that had gripped them for months, and they saw that the world had changed. Not intact, not bustling, but not entirely dead either. On the old stone roads, small blades of grass were beginning to grow. In the abandoned marketplaces, human voices slowly returned. The families who survived looked at one another and realized it was they, the ones still standing, who would rewrite the order of this new world. They did not forget the pain. They did not forget the bells, the groans, the wind pounding against their roofs. But from within all that darkness, one truth still shone. Humanity always finds a way to keep living, even if it was only through a warm meal, a half-burned candle, an embrace in the middle of the night, or simply the steady breathing of the person lying beside them. In the longest night of history, the light was always small, but it never went out. And it was that fragile little light that led humanity out of the Black Death and toward another tomorrow.